Well, thank you again for the kind invitation to be with you. I have a sign up for our family prayer letter so that if you can pray for us and want to track down where the Siglers are going and what we're doing, this is our Ariel Ministries prayer letter for us, Bernice and Tim Sigler. And if you want to sign up, you're welcome to do that. And then I want to say there's been a wonderful response to the book purchase last night for the volume that Arnold and I had an opportunity to contribute to, What Should We Think About Israel? And so I see there are a few left, but there are other volumes there as well, and especially in light of the topic that we'll discuss today, a proper perspective on Israel and the Middle East, where yesterday we looked at the biblical and theological perspective. Today we turn to the aspect of the historical perspective and try to get a framework for where we're at today in light of where history has been. Ariel Ministries has published a book by Paul Wilkinson called Israel Betrayed. Now this one is volume 2, and it deals with the rise of Christian Palestinianism. So if during our conversations today you realize, not all Christians would agree with you and your take on the history, where do you get that? Well, I want to suggest that Paul Wilkinson's book provides plenty of the documentation and historical background, and there are a couple copies on the table, and they will be available to us today as well. So, without further ado, we'll launch right into today's discussion. Again, dealing with the historical side of things. Perhaps, since we'll be looking at some rather serious topics, I would lighten the mood a little bit with a brief story. The story goes like this, that back in the day, Ariel Sharon and Yasser Arafat, the then head of the PLO, were both forced into one of these monotonous peace summits at some city in Europe where things like this have tended to happen on a regular basis. And before the meeting began, then Ariel Sharon at the peace summit asked permission if he could provide a brief historical sketch. And the folks in the room, all kind of looked at Yasser Arafat to see what his opinion would be, and he thought, sure. And so Sharon launches in. He says, long before our current conflict, the children of Israel, we were, with Moses in the wilderness. We had escaped Egypt, and we were slaves, and now we are in the desert, and we're wandering and wandering for many years. And in fact, there was a season that was very, very dry, and there was no water for days and days, no water. But finally, someone in the distance, he says, I see an oasis. And we begin to run, and they run and find this oasis, and there was water enough for everyone to drink. Even the camels were given to drink, and even Moses, he took a bath. But when he emerged from the water, he realized, he says, someone stole my clothes. And they asked, who stole his clothes? He said, someone told him, it was the Palestinian. To this, Yasser Arafat jumps up from his chair and objects and says, there were no Palestinians back then. And Ariel Sharon says, exactly. And now that we have established this historical fact, we can proceed with the peace process. So, we will discuss some of the historical background to this conflict today. And we're not alone in attempting to look back at history and discover the past. Keith Whitelam, in a book called The Invention of Ancient Israel, suggests that the way we read the Bible and history promotes, in his subtitle suggests, promotes the silencing of Palestinian history. Now, the Journal for the Study of the Old Testament, not a particularly Bible-believing publication, but a highly academic publication, a journal, says that Whitelam can and will be criticized for introducing politics into ancient Israel. He is merely exposing it. And the Palestinians are, after all, the major victims of a Zionizing European and American biblical scholarship. This book should be paperback and compulsory reading. Well, further from the back cover, Keith Whitelam's groundbreaking study argues that biblical scholars, through their traditional view of this region, have contributed to dispossession of both a Palestinian land and a Palestinian past. This is important reading for historians, biblical specialists, social anthropologists, and all those who are interested in the history of ancient Israel and Palestine. Now, his claim in the book is that there is a connection between the ancient Philistines, for whom this land was eventually renamed in about 132 AD by Hadrian, and that there was a continuation of the ancient Philistines throughout history in some way, even though they fade off the scene. Today's Palestinian Arabs are the inheritors of that Palestinian tradition. We'll talk more about this tomorrow afternoon. But his claim is that biblical scholars who, as the journal summarizes, would have a traditional view of this region. When you see traditional view, you need to realize that traditional describes what everybody believed until like 5 minutes ago. Like if we talk about traditional marriage, like no one had to ask what marriage is. They knew that marriage was between a man and a woman. Or a traditional view of, many things. You just, well, what were these views? Or maybe we could say a straightforward reading of the Bible, because he's stating that biblical scholars, through this traditional view, have contributed to the dispossession of both the Palestinian land. So that means the land that is called Israel today, the claim is that Israel has stolen land from the Palestinians. And a dispossession of a Palestinian past. The claim is that what is claimed as a Jewish connection to this land is dispossessing this land from its quote-unquote rightful owners, and stealing and silencing Palestinian history. This has been called Zionizing European and American biblical scholarship, and it is this sort of approach to the history of the region that is common on college campuses today, to look at people groups in light of the oppressor and the oppressed through a lens known as cultural Marxism. And so if you're on a side that is not the minority, but you're the majority, then you must have oppressed others for them to become the minorities. And, well, you should be punished. And frankly, anything that happens to you is valid, is condoned, because, look, you're an oppressor. And so we have seen this in the United States with various days of rage, where businesses all through the main streets of various cities have had their windows bashed in, they've been set on fire, anything that happens, well, those are the people with money, And if they have the money, they must have stolen it from other people, and so they deserve what's coming to them. They deserve to be victimized. Now, of course, all of this can sound quite rational until someone thinks you have more than they have, and then you become the victimizer. I've heard it put like this: if you're not a socialist in your 20s, maybe you have no heart. But if you're not a conservative, by the time you get a real job and start buying your own home in your 30s, then you might have, no math, because you begin to realize that if you gave everything away, or if you pass laws that cause it all to be taken away, then the whole operation isn't going to work. As it's been suggested, socialism is fine until you run out of other people's money. This is why many people, in their approach to governing, are promoting a taxation, and they say of the rich, but increasingly, if you stay in the game long enough, you might become a property owner, and you see your values go up, and you make a few wise decisions, and pretty soon you're in one of those brackets that they want to tax because you're viewed as the rich. And you're thinking, wait. Again, you can always spend more than other people make. So this is all part of that cultural Marxism approach. And yet we want to challenge that in light of what we could call real history. The history that you could actually dig up in the ground. The history that you could read about in ancient documents and get a sense of some type of reality. And so in light of the claim that the Jewish people of today have no connection to this historic land, and that they have come in as immigrants and have taken away and dispossessed this land from the native population of indigenous Palestinians, then I would like to look at 3 stages of history and consider an historical survey of Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. And I would like to look at the state of Israel in antiquity, that there was a Jewish nation with Jewish rulers over Jewish cities and regions in this land. And then throughout the medieval period, that it's not as though all Jewish people left this land after 70 AD when the temple was destroyed, and after 132 AD after Hadrian's putting down of the Bar Kokhba revolt. In this dispersion where many Jewish people were scattered, it's not as though every Jewish person left this land, and it was, as that famous Nazi term for Jew-free, they were looking for a way to clear Europe of all the Jewish people. It is not as though this land was Jewish-free. It was still a land with a Jewish population in various centers throughout even the medieval period. And then we'll look at the state of Israel in the modern period, with the rise of the Aliyah movement, or immigration of mass numbers of Jewish people in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and then finally the establishment of the state of Israel in 1948. Well, let's begin with this first period of history, a Jewish presence in antiquity. And so we'll look at this Jewish presence in Israel from the time of Abraham. And the call of Abraham, which we discussed yesterday from Genesis chapter 12 and following, Abraham, go from the land where you live to the land of promise that I'm giving to you and to your descendants after you. And so around 2000 BC, until the time of the Assyrian invasion and crisis in the northern tribes with the fall of Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, in 722 BC, you have a large Jewish presence in the land. In fact, Ishmael, the son of Abraham, settles east of Eretz Israel in Genesis chapter 25. Yes, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the 12 tribes, go down into Egypt as a family, but then they come out as a great nation, and eventually under Moses are led out of Egypt, and then under Joshua are led into the promised land, somewhere right around 1400 BC. So while there was a sojourn for some 430 years in Egypt and then in the wilderness, they eventually return a great nation and enter the land. Well, even when we look at the period of the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, those are the three great empires that ruled what could be called the Fertile Crescent and the Middle East. And you can memorize these in order if you just learn your ABPs: Assyria, Babylonia, Persia. But the Assyrians, they come first on the scene as a major empire. You'll recall Jonah interacts with them as he goes and preaches to that great city Nineveh. Nineveh was one of their capitals, the Assyrians. And then the Babylonians, of course, Babylon is the namesake for their great city and capital, but they also take over the same general area as the Assyrians. They are the ones who, under Nebuchadnezzar, come south into Judah, destroy the temple, take its treasures. Daniel chapter 1 records this, taking those treasures into Babylon. And they also take people like Daniel himself, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. As you know their names, they're Babylonian names because their real names had been changed from names that had theophoric components. In other words, the name of God was a part of their name. Like Daniel means God is my judge. Dan is judge, and El for God. But his name is changed. Emotional extra credit. If anyone knows the Babylonian name of Daniel,
Belteshazzar.
there you go, Belteshazzar. Well, you see, Bel was one of the deities of the Babylonians, and so they want to rename these Hebrew children with Babylonian names that speak not of the God of Israel, but of the gods of the Babylonians. And similarly, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, their names are changed to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So you have the Babylonians. This is the time of the exile, where for 70 years the Judahites had been taken from their land and placed throughout the Babylonian Empire. And it was often the best and brightest who were taken. And like Daniel, they were used as advisors. Advisors for anything that they could mine from the Hebrew children to learn about their region and their enemies, their science and technologies, and plunder anything they could from them. And so you have the period of the Babylonian exile where for a good 70 years the Jewish people are there in Babylon. Well, the Persians come on the scene. Remember your ABPs, Assyria, Babylonia, now Persia. The Persians come on the scene, and you have a new ruler, a new sheriff in town, and he's going to have a new foreign policy. The king of Persia, named Cyrus, he was already predicted by name in the book of Isaiah long, long before. This is one of the reasons that critical scholars will say, look, that could not have been written when the other parts of Isaiah were written. This could not be from the 700s because now we're in the 500s. This is like 150 years in advance that they're naming the name of Cyrus in the book of Isaiah. So there must be different people writing. In fact, they're writing history after the fact to make it look like prophecy. Anybody can do that, you know. I predict that there will be the establishment of the United States of America in 1776. And you know, now, of course, you can look back on that. But if you claim that this document predicting it was written in 1700, then, you're a prophet. And so that's what they're claiming was done with the book of Isaiah, predicting that Cyrus would be, a favorable ruler for the Jewish people. But friends, it wasn't a false prophecy. It wasn't an antedated prophecy. It was real prophecy. It really was the scroll of Isaiah recording this event before it ever happened. That's the way Bible prophecy works. And Cyrus, the king of Persia, he provides a decree to say that the Jewish people can return home. And in fact, they can rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. Now, let's be clear. He wasn't doing this because, Nebuchadnezzar was the big meanie and Cyrus is Mr. Nice Guy. No, he has a different foreign policy. And his foreign policy, instead of taking people captive into his kingdom and learning everything he can from them, and maybe he did some of that, but his approach was new and different. He realized that at the other end of the Fertile Crescent, the most threatening group of people that, from a Persian perspective, the most important empire and kingdom that would be a threat to him and his rule were the ancient Egyptians. And so, what borders ancient Egypt but the land that had been the land of Judah? And he thought, who could I put there who would be a buffer for me against the Egyptians should the Egyptians choose to move north on that land bridge between the continents? I'll put these Judahites there because they believe their God gave them this land as an inheritance, and they'll fight tooth and nail. In fact, I'll tell them they can rebuild their temple, and I'll give them a boatload of money and tell them, make it really nice. So you'll really want to defend it. And so he takes the Judahites and allows them to return and build a temple. Perhaps you'll recall reading the books of Ezra and Nehemiah about how the Jewish people are returning to the land. And as they do, people like Zerubbabel, he's among them. Zerubbabel, his name comes from two Hebrew words. One is the word describing that land of Babylon, Babel. Does that sound familiar? Babylon. And then Zerah means seed in Hebrew. So he is a seed or descendant of Babel. He was born in Babylon. Zerubbabel. And when the Judahites return, they see their land in waste. They see the temple in ruins. They are not encouraged at all. And so they call out to him, and I think their plea went something like this: Zerubbabel, we're in trouble. The temple lies in rubbable. Get over here on the double. So sure enough, Zerubbabel comes. He's helping out, kind of directing affairs, and the temple is being rebuilt. And we see this through the books of Haggai and Zechariah toward the end of the prophetic era. And sure enough, there is this regaining of prominence, a regaining of historical significance for Jewish people in the land at the end of the exile. Well, that's not the end of Jewish history. No, as the temple now is in existence, and we are in a period of history that might be known as the Second Temple period, because you have Solomon, who was commanded to build, or allowed to build, the first temple, and then that temple is destroyed in 586 BC with the coming of the Babylonians, and now they build this second temple period, second temple under Ezra, Nehemiah, Zerubbabel, and so forth. It's in existence, but the Greeks now come into power. I actually like to use the date, I have it listed here as 332, but 333 is the rough date that I like to use for Alexander the Great, who's really Macedonian, but he rules over what becomes known as the Greek Empire. 333, why? Because there are three parts to his name. Alexander the Great. And I can remember that. So 333 BC. He conquers the known world at the time. And his empire stretches almost from what would be called later the British Isles, clear to China. That's a lot of land and a lot of power. And he accomplishes this early on in life and in his rule, and he dies at an early age. Then his kingdom is divided up between four of his generals. One to the northeast of Israel, with its capital around Damascus in modern-day Syria. These are called the Seleucids. And then another group in Egypt, and they are known as the Ptolemies. So the P is silent on Ptolemies, but turn to your neighbor and say Egypt. You know, this is, you have that PT there, and then turn back and say Ptolemies. I mean, you can remember that the Seleucids, Syria in the north, and the Ptolemies in Egypt in the south. And so what's in between that? Well, the Promised Land, this land that is under dispute even to this day. And this places the Judahites, who have now rebuilt their temple. And from this word Judah, the tribe of Judah, and the territorial region of Judea, comes the importance of the identity of the Jewish people. Well, the Jews are now under attack from the Greeks. And the Greeks, as they expand their empire, they want everyone paying taxes to them, and they want, this is what governments tend to do, and they want control over all the laws. And in order to exert their power over the Jews in Jerusalem, Antiochus Epiphanes IV comes into town and sacrifices a pig on the altar in Jerusalem. Now, he probably got this from the playbook called How to Really Tick Off the Jews. I mean, because the altar, this is a holy place in the temple. And then he takes the most symbolically unclean animal, a pig, and sacrifices it on the altar. Well, can I tell you that all Hanukkah broke loose? This is actually the background to the holiday known as Hanukkah today. Hanukkah means dedication. And the first time it's called the Feast of Dedication in all of Jewish literature is in the New Testament book of John, chapter 10, the Feast of Dedication. The Feast of Dedication, Hanukkah, commemorates that after this evil episode with Antiochus Epiphanes IV sacrificing a pig on the altar, this family, the Maccabees, they are enraged, and they gather up a loose band of untrained soldiers, and they push back and fight against the Greek army, and they actually win. Sometimes when you're ticked enough, you can do things you didn't think you could do. And sure enough, this allows the Greeks to rethink their approach, and they say, whoa, you can actually rededicate your temple and have sacrifices again and have some quasi-independence, and that's exactly what they do. And they rededicate the temple. Perhaps you're familiar with the tradition of lighting the candle, because a much later Jewish tradition that wasn't written down for hundreds of years later, so I say that to suggest that this may not have happened, or when one rabbi was pushed on the historicity of whether this tradition is true, he said, well, yeah, I realize there's no documentation that this ever really happened. It's a tradition, but it's our tradition, and I like it. So it still is celebrated as an important tradition today to light the Hanukkah, or the Hanukkah menorah, because this lighting of now not the normal number of 3 on each side and then a shamash candle or servant candle, so a 7-branch golden candelabra, but the Hanukkah menorah, the Hanukkah as it's called, has 4 on each side plus a lighter, so 8 candles plus a lighter. And Why 8 candles? Because according to this tradition that was written down much, much later, they only had 1 day's worth of consecrated oil to be able to keep the menorah burning in the temple. And it would take a full week for there to be a new batch of consecrated oil. But they went ahead and lit the menorah with the oil they had, and miracle of miracles, 1 day's worth of oil lasted for 8 days and nights. And so at Hanukkah, it's this 8 nights of Hanukkah, and you're commemorating the rededication of the temple, whether it really happened that way or not. But that's the tradition. Well, this relates to this period under the Greeks. And during this time, around 150-ish BC, you have Antiochus Epiphanes and the defiling of the temple and the revolt of the Maccabees. But now we look at another period of history with the rise of the Roman Empire. So for empires, it's not like there wasn't anyone else by way of smaller city-states or even kingdoms and such, but these are the empires. These are the ones that ruin and rule everything. It's Assyria, Babylonia, Persia, and then the Greeks, and then the Romans. And so now we come to the Romans, and we ask, almost like with every one of these, and what did they do to harm the Jews? Perhaps you'll recall that as the Romans begin to rule, they continue a trend that was true under the Greeks in light of what could be called Hellenism. Hellenism, by the way, isn't the worship of the goddess Helen any more than Judaism is the worship of the goddess Judy. But Hellenism relates to the way Greeks say Greek, or Greece, Hellene. So Hellenism is the appreciation and imposition of Greek language and culture. And the Romans continue this, and under their more Latin-based rule from Rome, they acquire what had been the Greek Empire, and they continue to use the Greek language as the lingua franca, or this important trade language. And so this is the reason that the New Testament is actually written in Greek. And an important question might even be, what language did Jesus speak in the first century? Well, I remember this question being put to me at an important moment. I was living in Israel on that sabbatical from Moody Bible Institute, teaching biblical archaeology in 09-10. And on one occasion, I went through the old city, and I'm, surrounded by all these shops. It's actually quite bizarre. And you see all these tapestries and bakeries, and I noticed this guy selling cookies, and he looked very friendly, and I'm walking, and he greets me, and I greet him back, and then he said, "I have a question for you." And I'm trying to, I was actually on a mission. I was trying to find gifts for each of the women in my wife's women's Bible study, and I had something in mind, this beautiful little ceramic teapot that I had seen, but I need to collect 10 of them. So I'm like going from shop to shop and buying each one that I could find, and yet the guy seemed very friendly, and he said, "I have a question for you." And I said, "Okay." He said, "Are you a teacher?" And I thought, "Well, yeah." And he said, "Well, what do you teach?" And I said, "Well, I'm actually teaching an archaeology class right now." "Really? Of what period?" "Well, biblical, archaeology." And he said, "I have a question for you." And I said, "An education isn't free." And he said, "Have a cookie." I said, "All right." So he said, "Here's my question. What language did Jesus speak?" And I thought, well, he's Jewish, and we have record of him reading from the scroll of Isaiah in the synagogue in his hometown of Nazareth, where he grew up. So he spoke Hebrew. But, of course, that's in the Galilee region, and even the prophet Isaiah calls it Galilee of the nations, Galilee of the Gentiles, and certainly by the time of the 1st century, you have Hellenistic Judaism being much appreciated and on the rise, and so it's very likely that he would have spoken Greek. You have inscriptions in synagogue floors in Greek in the Galilee, so he likely was able to communicate in Greek. But also, many Jewish people, especially after the after the exile as they returned from Babylon, and the major trade language throughout the Middle East and the Fertile Crescent was Aramaic. Many Jews of the 1st century in that region, of course, were speaking Aramaic. So I think he spoke at least Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. He thought, that's a really good answer. Have another cookie. And we became friends. And Khalil would invite me back, and I would bring students to his cookie shop. And we would talk about the Bible. And over the years, he eventually shared with me some of his other questions. And his questions were so good that eventually I asked him, have you already come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah? And he looked a little cautious because, he's not in an easy neighborhood to be able to say yes out loud. But he did affirm that he had come to saving faith. Well,
was he Jewish or Arab?
Muslim.
Huh?
Mm-hmm. So I'm really grateful for this ongoing friendship, and the power of the gospel, and cookies aren't bad either. So we think about the rise of Hellenism and the linguistic and cultural influence of the Greeks, even throughout the Roman Empire. And during the time of the Romans, in 70 AD, they had been exerting their power, and the Jewish people have been pushing back against the unacceptable aspects of the Romans and of Hellenism. But finally, the Romans put down Jewish revolt in a big stomping manner and destroyed the temple. This, of course, did not end Jewish revolts. It kind of like during the time of the Maccabees really infuriated some people, and so they go on the defensive and they are revolting even further, and you find the tragic events both in the Galilee at the site of Arbel, where on this cliff front Jewish people are hiding in caves, and the Romans are lowering down their soldiers in big wooden baskets with flaming arrows that they would shoot into the caves and set the rebels on fire. It was a terrible time. Or you read about the account of the mass suicide at Masada, and you can go there today and see even the potsherds with the Hebrew names inscribed on them that tell the names of the last remaining maybe 10 people whose job it was to kill one another after having all killed each person, their own family members, and then themselves. And just tragedy upon tragedy. All of this taking place under the Roman rule. And yet, where the Romans could simply subjugate Jewish people, their dwellings and towns were allowed to remain. Even after the eventual Christianization of the Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine era, after 325 AD, with the conversion, at least so-called conversion, of Constantine, you have this Christianized Roman Empire that lasts until the rise of Islam in the 600s. So you have the Romans in their paganism, and then in their quasi-Christian influence, known as the Byzantine period. And yet what I've tried to trace for you that all along from the time of Abraham there have still been Jewish people in this land. So the state of Israel in antiquity. If you would look at the kingdom of David and Solomon in the 10th century BC, you would note that Jerusalem becomes the unquestioned capital of the Israelite kingdom, and their place of power was in the hill country, which becomes known as Judea, and to the north Samaria. That's the striped area in the center. And then stretching out even further with influence even over and through and past Damascus and reaching toward the Euphrates River in terms of their trade influence. But we also have to note that their basic area of importance after the Babylonian Empire and the Persian allowance of Jews to return to Judea and to have the rebuilding of this kingdom of Judah or Judea, they come back to a neighborhood where not everyone is welcoming them home and saying, "The Jews are back! We're so glad you're here!" No, you remember how they rebuilt the temple and rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem with a trowel in one hand and a sword in the other. Now, to the north, you have Samaria. Who is there during this time? Well, Samaria is a land based on the name of the city, Samaria, which had been the capital among the northern tribes of Israel. But now it's a region where people who had been left as Jews from the time of the deportation of the northern tribes under the Assyrians, 722 BC, the Assyrians also brought other people whom they had conquered and placed them in this land. And so you have the northern tribes of Israel, those leftovers who weren't dispersed, and you have these imports, and you have other local peoples who were not Jewish, the Am Haaretz, the people of the land, and they all begin to sort of intermarry. And you think about when this took place in 722 BC, this is before the exile and before a lot of the historical books and prophetic books were written. And so the Samaritans developed their own sort of syncretistic or blended, and by the way, syncretism deals with the blending of unblendable things. You're mixing Judaism and paganism and various cultures together. And it emerges as this group, the Samaritans, so that by the time you get to the New Testament will tell you the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. And the Samaritans, by the way, were not the victims of the Roman fury. Their temple was not destroyed by the Romans. Their presence was still allowed to remain. And the Samaritans are still a people group that exists to this very day in the same areas where they existed throughout antiquity. Their beliefs are based largely on the Torah and none of the rest of the Old Testament, because remember, they weren't a part of that history that led to the dispersion in 722. They stayed there. And therefore they weren't a part of the Jewish exile into Babylon and the return. They just stayed there. And so their history looks at how do we worship God based on our traditions and the Torah, the first 5 books. And so they did believe in a sacrificial system. They did believe in priests. They had a high priest. And today they still have a high priest. And they still have priests. And they still sacrifice a lamb at Passover. In fact, lambs plural. And increasingly, this becomes quite the sight to see. While we were there in 09-10 as a family, we learned of a whole pilgrimage of other people from various religious groups, both Orthodox Jews, evangelical Christians, and anybody else who wanted to come, just curious people from all over the world, to go and see what they do at the Samaritan Passover. And so we packed a picnic lunch. It was going to be a big all-day affair. We drive up toward Mount Gerizim, where they're going to have this huge event. And we park our car. We have some friends with us, and we're all going to watch what's going on as they select a lamb. We watched that they would like spray paint after inspecting it all for any defect and making sure this was, kosher for Passover. They would paint a little stripe on the back of this particular lamb, and that was marked for sacrifice. And they had a whole pen of these sacrificed lambs ready to go, and their priests were all dressed in white from head to toe, kind of like they worked in a butcher shop, and with white gum boots, because there was going to be a lot of blood. And you got to think about what priests did in ancient Israel. They oversaw the sacrificial system. So this was not some, like academic job where they're sitting around just reading the Bible. They're out there dealing with animals and slaughtering the animals. And this is what the priests of ancient Israel did. And this is what the priests in Samaria do to this very day. And so we got to see the whole thing take place, how they sacrifice the lambs, how they prepare them to be burnt on the altar. It was a mind-blowing educational experience. Our kids got to, pet the little lambs and all of that. And then they got to see what happened to them next. So, this is Samaria, a culture that still exists to this very day. Idumea, toward the south, this area is a spillover from ancient Edom, which would have been south of Moab, the area of the Nabateans, a group known for their amazing trade routes. Well, you have Idumea. So this is kind of the map of where Jewish people were. By the way, Herod the Great, he was an Idumean. He was inbred with the Edomites and part Jewish and so forth. To the north of the map, you have the Galilee region. On the east side of the Sea of Galilee, you have Perea, and then the Moabites to the east of the Dead Sea. All of this area is connected to the patriarchs and their descendants, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and so forth. So a Jewish presence in the land in antiquity. Now let's move to the medieval period. There was a Jewish presence in Eretz Israel during the time of the rise of Islam under the Arabs, and under the revolt against Islam by the Christianized Roman Empire, the Byzantines. You could call them by this time the Crusaders. And then there was a counter-revolt by the Arabs again, and they win against the Crusaders in 1291 AD. And eventually you have the rise of the Ottoman Turkish Empire. So let's discuss this for a moment. Israel in the medieval period. It was approximately 132 AD. We're still now in the period of antiquity when Hadrian comes on the scene to rename various parts of this land. And he takes Judea, Samaria, and says, well, this is the main part, and so let's name this after the ancient Philistines who are no longer here to bother us. Because the Romans are pretty smart historians. And through psychological warfare, before it was even known to be called that, he says, how can we cause these Jewish people never to revolt against us again? Again, we're going to reorient the whole land. We're going to rename the whole land. He renamed Jerusalem emotional extra credit, if any of you know the name that was given to Jerusalem by Hadrian.
Capitolina.
Oh, very good. Aelia Capitolina. Most people don't know this. I mean, because that name didn't stick. So it kind of goes the way of all earth, you know, Aelia Capitolina. But can I just point out to you, I wanted to bring up that name because it doesn't sound very Jewish. That's why he wanted to name it Aelia Capitolina, somewhat naming it after himself as the emperor. Aelia Capitolina, this is his capital city in this region. Aelia Capitolina sounds like something you'd order off the menu in a fine Italian restaurant. I'll have the number 13, Aelia Capitolina, with a side of marinara, please. I mean, not very Jewish sounding. And yet, that's exactly why he wanted to rename Jerusalem. Because Jerusalem is a name that's right there in the Bible, in the Hebrew Scripture. It connects with the kingdom of David and its capital in Jerusalem. But he wants to wipe that from human history, and he also wants to wipe out the name Israel and Judah off of this map. And so that area, which was the northern tribes of Israel and the southern tribes of Judah, it's prime real estate. And so he's going to call this Palestina Prima. Why does he pick the name Palestine? He chooses the name Palestina because it sounds like the same consonants as that people group who were once the ancient enemies of Israel, but are no longer a threat to Israel because they're not around. And therefore they will never be a threat to the Roman Empire either. The ancient Philistines. You see the consonants? Palestine, Philistine. And so he renames it after the ancient Philistines. This is the main area, Palestina Prima. And then the Galilee becomes renamed as Palestina Segunda. And the desert area of the Negev is Palestina Tertia, or first, second, and third areas of Palestine. And yet, during this entire period that stretches from antiquity all the way through the medieval period, the next map, from the 7th to the 11th centuries, Jewish populations continue to exist in this land. These cities, including the city El Arish, where that is named for the wadi that runs near there, Wadi El Arish, and then the city of Rafia, which that's in the news a lot these days because of the Rafah border crossing area where a lot of the Palestinian population from the Gaza Strip have been pushed down to that area, and this is the last holdout of some of the Hamas leadership, and so Israel is going into Rafah, and that's a hotbed of the conflict right now. Of course, north of that, you have the 5 cities of the Philistines, which make their way into biblical history: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, moving inland to Gath and Ekron. These 5 city-states, some of them, 2 of them on the coast, are represented on this map. But how do you know that there's a Jewish population in these various cities like Nablus and Jericho and Hebron and so forth, which are today in what is called the West Bank? Or more about that term a little later. How do you know that there's a Jewish population there? Well, because artifacts and ancient texts. Ancient texts that talk about what was happening there. But also, there is a wonderful little museum that few tours of Israel bother to stop at because there's just so much to see. How can you see it all? As you come up from Jericho toward Jerusalem, on the left-hand side of the road, on the south of the main highway 1, is a little museum. There's a sign that says the Good Samaritan Inn, because the New Testament account of the Good Samaritan, who, remember the Good Samaritan who was attacked and left for dead, and then, a priest and a Levite come, nobody helps him, but a Samaritan comes to help him. And we just spoke about the ancient Samaritans with whom the Jews have no dealings. But so to say a good Samaritan, this kind of took people back. Like, what do you mean a good Samaritan? Yeah, he helped the person who was left for dead. And Jesus' moral of the story was to tell his disciples, this is what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, who's my neighbor? Well, he tells the story, and basically anyone created in the image of God. They're our neighbors, and we show God's love to them. Well, this Good Samaritan Inn has become a tourist spot, a museum, if you will, to collect the mosaic floors from synagogues that were all throughout what is now the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, in cities where there's a majority Muslim population and where synagogues have been torched and they have been demolished, and they've been, and they thought, we can't have these ancient artifacts of antiquity ruined, and so they take up the mosaic floors from these synagogues with beautiful and ornate, colorful images of biblical scenes, and they brought them all to the Good Samaritan Inn, and they made this whole museum. Some are now on the walls, and some are still on floors, and they've all been, this is the synagogue floor from Gaza, or this is from Jericho, or this is from another city which now is under the control of the Palestinian Authority, or has for years been given into the hands of the Arabs. And now on the road from Jericho to Jerusalem you have this museum, which again shows with artifactual evidence that there was a Jewish population center, because those synagogues, they weren't built during the time of the Old Testament. They were built in the medieval period, and there were Jewish people doing it. And so there you have the evidence for Jewish communities in the land of Israel. But now let's fast forward past the medieval period and go to the modern period. The state of Israel in the modern period, and an individual known as Theodor Herzl. He is called the father of modern Zionism. He was a journalist in Austria, and he began to take special note of the persecutions of the Jewish people throughout Europe and policies that were passed against Jewish people and their right to live in certain areas. And as he noted this, he realized that there really can't be safety for Jews in Europe and in the diaspora apart from the establishment of a safe zone, a Jewish homeland. And at first he even said, we'll basically take anywhere that we can make safe. There was openness to the idea of the establishment of a Jewish state in Uganda, in Africa. It's like, how can we get away from all this anti-Semitism? Let's just go as far as we can away from what we're seeing in Europe and this hatred of the Jewish people. We'll just buy some land that nobody cares about, and we'll make sure we pay for it so no one claims that we're stealing it, and But this idea that was floated at the World Jewish Congress was like not of interest. He basically got boos and tomatoes from the audience, and no one showed real interest in that. And a better backstory is the fact that there were already in the 1800s, you got to think of the Protestant Reformation and the reclaiming of the Bible in the language of the people, and an emphasis on a literal, historical, grammatical approach to just read the Bible at face value and see what it says. And the Bible predicts that God is going to regather the Jews to the land, even in unbelief, before the Messiah returns. So that in unbelief, Zechariah 12:10, they can look on him whom they have pierced and mourn for him as one mourns for an only child. That there will be a mass acceptance of the Messiah when he returns for that generation. But for there to be Jewish people in Jerusalem, when Messiah returns to the Mount of Olives, they have to be regathered to this place. And so among Christian interpreters, there was the acknowledgement that really the Jews need to be back in the biblical homeland of what has been renamed as Palestine. And there were precursors to the father of modern Zionism, Theodore Herzl. One of them, his name was William E. Blackstone. And he published what you can even read about on Wikipedia as the Blackstone Memorial. The Blackstone Memorial was his document to call after the end of the Ottoman Turkish Empire and the establishment of many other states and countries within Europe as people carved up the map and gave this land to these people and this land to those people. He said, why can we also not give the land of Palestine to the Jewish people? It is, after all, their ancient biblical homeland. And he had signatures from numerous world leaders and U.S. politicians. And this document is delivered to the President of the United States with over 400 global signatures. Again, a document known as the Blackstone Memorial. Nathan Strauss, a leader of Zionism within the Jewish community. In fact, the city of Netanya in Israel, north of Tel Aviv, is named after Nathan Strauss. Funny side story, the Jewish National Fund and those who were promoting the purchase of land for the establishment of the State of Israel, they came to Nathan Strauss and said, look, if you'll donate to our cause, we'll name this city after you. And he had given many, many gifts and been very generous previously. And so he did. He gave $1,000. They were rather crestfallen. They were hoping for more zeros. But they were good on their word. He'd given many times before. They named the city of Netanya after Nathan Strauss. And he went on to give much more. But he's a famous promoter of early Zionism. He wrote to William E. Blackstone, this friend of D.L. Moody, by the way, in Chicago. Blackstone, by the way, eventually moved to Los Angeles and became the first academic dean at Biola University. It's an acronym for the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, Biola. So like he had been a friend of D.L. Moody, who established the Moody Bible Institute, this William E. Blackstone goes to LA and becomes the first academic dean at Biola. Well, Nathan Strauss writes to William E. Blackstone, and he said that Judge Brandeis, a Jewish justice of the Supreme Court, Judge Brandeis agrees with me that you are actually the father of modern Zionism because your work predates Herzl. I had the privilege of holding that original letter in my hand from the Billy Graham archives at Wheaton College and reading this famous document. At the time, I served on the board of directors of the organization that William E. Blackstone founded in the 1800s. It was then called the Chicago Hebrew Mission, and today it's called Life in Messiah International. Well, that's background to Theodore Herzl. Theodore Herzl presents at the First Zionist Congress in 1897. Some years later, Lord Arthur Balfour, a British politician, promotes a declaration that seeks for a home for the Jewish people in Palestine. And sure enough, many people come on board with this idea of establishing a homeland for the Jewish people in the ancient biblical lands. During the time of the Holocaust and World War II, of course, there was all sorts of pro-Nazi propaganda, films that you can view in Holocaust museums around the world today, show the Nazi propaganda of school-age children who were Jews dancing around and singing songs in concentration camps as if these were just places to place Jewish people in safety, trying to hide the fact that these were death camps and labor camps and places where people were tortured with cruel medical experiments done on their bodies. All these atrocities hidden by the Nazi regime. But somewhere during the war, the word is getting out that terrible things are happening and that millions of Jewish people are being systematically killed in camps throughout Europe. By the time you come to the end of World War II, there is at the United Nations like a blip on the radar screen of sympathy for the Jewish people. A realization as American troops come into these concentration camps and film the atrocities that have been going on there, there is a desire to say, well, maybe the Jewish people do need a safe zone. Maybe they do need a homeland. Maybe they need a land of their own. And so a partition plan was proposed, and it looks something like this. You notice in the colored map here, you have the red section being partitioned for the Jewish population, and the yellow for the Arab population, and then Jerusalem is in blue as sort of an international zone, or welcoming to all. And if I could point out for a moment that the red area in the Galilee region had been malarial swamps, and that Jewish immigrants through the Aliyah movement, through the immigration of Jewish people to the area from the late 1800s and early 1900s, they have been seeking to reclaim some of those malarial swamps, planting imported trees that were not indigenous to the land. The trees were eucalyptus trees. They were known for being able to suck up lots of water and help promote a transformation of swamps into arable farmland. And so then not only that land, but along the coast, the sandy and rocky coasts of the Mediterranean. And then in the south, what topography and geography and climate zone do you find there? It's desert. It's not like, here you go, welcome to the promised land flowing with milk and honey. No, it's like, take these areas that have been malarial swamps and this little sliver along the coast, and then you can have the desert too. And the Jewish people say, we'll take it. And the Arabs say, absolutely not. And this is the reality in 1947, as many Jewish people are trying to escape Europe still, where they had suffered so much under the Holocaust, and come to these shores. But the British are still, holding off Jewish immigration to British Mandate Palestine. The British are in control. This is after the rise of the Ottoman Turks. Now the British have had control for many years. This is during the period known as the British Mandate. And so the British are the ones with the mandate to figure out what's going to happen with the population and how it's going to be partitioned. This proposal at the UN develops for something along these lines. And it's in this time period that you have finally enough frustration among the Jewish people that they declare their independence from Britain. Just like the United States declared our independence from the Brits, so also the Declaration of Independence is signed in Tel Aviv. Let's talk about that city for a moment, because the key book written by Theodor Herzl was called Alt Neuland. Now, I don't know how your Yiddish might be, but some of you might have studied at least a little German. And so auf Deutsch, if you can think about alt, this is old, and then neu, this is new, Land, land. And so his book, Alt Neuland, it's all squished together as one long word. That's how a lot of German works. You piece parts together. Alt Neuland, the old new land. What about this title? It's essentially saying, in the old, ancient, biblical homeland of the Jews, we need to establish a new, modern country. And he's calling for the homeland of the Jewish people in Palestine. Well, in the early 1900s, on those sand dunes along the coast, a modern city is desired, a city with a symphony and the arts and modern buildings in the Middle East. I mean, where camels and donkeys are going down the road, they want a modern city. And 60 families stood on the sand dunes. You can look for this picture if you just Google the word Tel Aviv. And they draw lots and determine who's going to be in which of these places. And they have a boulevard running through town and an ancient, place with a modern map. And they're going to make this into a modern city. And what do they choose to name it? Well, based on Herzl's book, Alt Neuland, in modern Hebrew, they choose a name based on Alt Neuland, something old. Like an archaeological mound is called a tell. And then something new. The word for springtime in Israel, where the flowers begin to blossom and the crops emerge from the ground, springtime is associated with the biblical month of Aviv. Aviv. And so this city is called Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv, the old new land. Now the old new city. And there it is on the shore of British Mandate Palestine. And it was in that city that Mayor Dizengoff, who was the mayor, but those are two different spellings, Meir and Mayor. He was the head of the town for Tel Aviv. His home has now become, or eventually became, like an art gallery, and now it's become Independence Hall because the Declaration of Independence was formed there. And it was signed by various representatives, and Israel is declared a modern state on May 14, 1948. The first president of Israel will be Chaim Weizmann, and early leaders invited the local Arabs and said, look, let's have peace, let's raise our children together, let's build schools and hospitals together, let's make this a prosperous place for all, and we invite you to join with us in this new, we'll say, democratic state of Israel. And some said yes. And you know what they became? Israeli Arabs with Israeli passports and IDs. They have full rights and opportunities. Many Israeli Arabs are among the most educated and upwardly mobile people in all of the Middle East. And those who said no, who did they become? Well, many of them decided, no, we want to fight for all of this. We want no Jewish state. Because remember, that's what they had said before. How about this partition? You take the best land, the Jews will get the worst land. And they said no. But now there is a Jewish state, and they decide to attack. And they enlist the Arab neighbors from all around. Look at the map. You have Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. On the other side of Jordan, you have Iraq, and their army was one of the main ones in the vanguard. And then you have Egypt, and to the southeast, you have Saudi Arabia. Sounds like a nice neighborhood to me. And this is where the modern state of Israel is. And even with just this little partitioned area, the goal was to drive the Jews into the sea, to eliminate this freshly formed modern state of Israel. And these surrounding Arabs joined together in attack. Now let me point out something also that becomes a part of the modern problem related to the Palestinian cause. When all these armies were gathering together to attack Israel and destroy this newly formed state, many of them told the local Arabs who were living in all of these areas, the red area and the yellow area, and Jerusalem, get out, get out. Get your people out of the war zone. Get your family out of the war zone, because when you come back and when we win, you'll come back and you can take your house and the Jews' house next to you. So get out, because we're attacking. And many of them fled. But miracle of miracles, it didn't happen the way the surrounding Arab nations predicted. This little group, against all odds, they actually win the War of Independence. And they've been in an almost constant state of war ever since for survival. When they won, they had more area over which they were in control than the original partition plan. And they had to keep it, kind of like when you have wars with varying topography and you get the highland, then you don't like give that back to your enemy, because then they're going to be shooting down at you. You know, it's the reality of war. When people want you dead, you have to keep fighting if you want to stay alive. It's not because you want to be at war. It's that you don't want to be dead. And so you have to be at war. So Israel was at war, and they win. But then, what follows the War of Independence? But yet another war, and another war, and another war, and another war, because the local Arab population that didn't want to acknowledge the initial establishment of the State of Israel still doesn't want to admit the current existence of a State of Israel. And so this is what we're up against. We're up against Israel existing or not existing, and large masses of people who say Israel should not exist. Now, what about those people who left their homes fleeing the war when all these massive armies of the Arabs were coming against the newly established State of Israel? They can't come back to their homes. I mean, they were against the establishment of the State of Israel in the beginning. They're not acknowledging the right of Israel to be there. Who are they called today? Palestinian refugees. Now, this is unique because in no other war are the people who were once refugees, and now it's been 75 years and change, never are they still called refugees. You think of all the nations that the United States has been at war with, and you think of how, well, in World War II, there was all this fighting with Japan, and many Japanese people were even placed in camps here in the United States, to our great shame, just out of fear that they might be colluding with the enemy. And you then think, okay, after the war, then people are released from these camps, and other Japanese who assisted the American cause in the war effort, okay, they are allowed to immigrate. They're refugees because maybe they couldn't go back to Japan. So you know, we have these human population challenges, but they themselves come as refugees. But the goal is never to stay a refugee. The goal is to eventually get cleared to live in freedom and to become a citizen. And so, within some years, they become Japanese Americans. They're citizens of the United States. And their children go on to learn English and to attend university and to get jobs, and they're American citizens. And there are thriving population centers with Japantown in this city and that city, thriving Japanese industries and companies to this very day. Or you think of Korean War and Korean populations who were refugees, but now they're citizens. And their children are growing up to be Americanized citizens with, Korean ethnicity. And, just keep going. What about the many German Americans and Italian Americans and Vietnamese and Laotian Americans and French Americans and, even if they were once refugees, the goal is never to stay a refugee, but to eventually live in peace and normalize after a war. But not the cause of the Palestinians. Do you know that the United Nations has one organization for all worldwide refugees of any war, except for those of the Palestinian cause? The Palestinians have a separate organization because they have a separate mentality about refugee status. Their thought is that if your grandparents or people that you've never even met but they're in your family line were alive in 1947 and they left and weren't able to go back to their homeland and the door is shut for them to return to this land, then you, as a descendant of those people, you are still considered a refugee. I mean, even if you're a medical doctor living in Kuwait or Canada or California, but you have family ancestry going back to that time, then you're a Palestinian refugee. Even if your life is rather normalized, even if you've never been there in your life, you're considered a Palestinian refugee. And now, while originally there may have been about 160,000 who were in that category, now they're in the millions with the children and grandchildren and so forth of all of these who were once legitimate refugees. And their law of return says that all of these millions of people should be able to come back and settle in this land, which that creates a little bit of a problem. Because if your attitude is still that there should be no state of Israel, you're not willing to recognize what has happened here in the modern period, and your goal is still the destruction and the elimination of Israel, then Israel is going to keep the door locked for these people to return. And thus, war after war after war relates to this conflict. Here's a map outlining the events leading up to the Six-Day War in 1967. Some of you may remember this happening in the Middle East. I was still a couple of years away from being born, but I read about it, and I hear about it, and I've met people who have experienced its realities. But let me give you a little backstory on the Six-Day War. Notice that Egyptian forces had come from Cairo and elsewhere, crossing the Nile River, crossing the Sinai Peninsula, coming down to the Sharm el-Sheikh area near the Strait of Tiran that opens up travel to the Gulf of Eilat and Gulf of Aqaba. And then you have forces from Lebanon with the Lebanese army right up to the border with Israel. The advance of the Syrian army, who at that time controlled the Golan Heights. If you've been to Israel and have looked at the Sea of Galilee, all the area on the east side of the Sea of Galilee that jets up as mountains right off the little coastal area there, that was all part of the Golan Heights. It's called Heights because you're looking right down on the Sea of Galilee. And it stays at this huge mountain plain area until you look down on the other side toward Damascus, about 60 miles away from Damascus. This is the Golan Heights area, and the Syrian army had come right to the border, looking right down on all the farming villages along the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River. And then you have the Iraqi army. They're right there by the Dead Sea and into the Samaritan hill country area, which is at that time owned by Jordan, and that's why the area of Judea and Samaria is called the West Bank, because the word bank in this context means boundary, the west boundary of Jordan, which is why many of us prefer not to call it by the name West Bank, because it suggests that, well, that really is the boundary of Jordan and should belong to Jordan. Further, you have the Jordanian army participating as well, and Saudi Arabian troops coming to close off the Straits of Tiran and not allow travel toward the port in Eilat in Israel. And also, the Transjordanian highlands look right down onto the Arava, the area between the Dead Sea and the Gulf of Eilat for the Red Sea. They're looking down at that travel route that runs between the two seas, and it's just not looking good at all. All these armies are pushing right up against the border. It's like you're in a bad neighborhood and hoodlums are starting to walk toward you and your wife as you walk from the restaurant to your car, and you're wondering what's going to happen next. You know, you only have a little bit of time to make decisions. Do I go back into the restaurant and call the police? Do I hurry and try to get in our car and lock the doors and speed away? And the intent of these particular armies are not even as uncertain as the hoodlums that are perfect strangers that you might observe walking toward you from across the street. You just know that you've got that spidey sense that, like, this is dangerous! But for them, these nations had already sworn the destruction of Israel. You don't have to guess, I wonder what they're going to do to us. They have been saying that they want to free this area of Jewish people, and that they want to liberate Palestine. In this mindset, the idea of liberating Palestine needs to be examined. The PLO had been established by now in the 1960s. The PLO stands for the Palestine Liberation Organization. Let's be clear about that it doesn't stand for the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Why is that important? Because if we're just talking about helping poor Palestinians have a better standard of living, having more human rights, having better representation, having, opportunity, then many Jewish people are very happy to promote the betterment of the lives of Palestinian Arabs. In fact, numerous nonprofit organizations exist with the creation of jobs and educational opportunities, medical help, and all sorts of things to assist the local Arab population. But that's not what the PLO is desiring. Read the PLO charter and you will learn what the Palestinians have stated about their own goals. The PLO charter, which we'll look at in our afternoon session today, calls for the elimination of Zionism in Palestine. Well, how will you eliminate the wish for a Jewish homeland in Palestine other than eliminating the Jews that live there? I mean, it's very clear what the intention of these armies that are all coming in, pressing in. And so Israel has a decision to make, and they choose to do a preemptive strike. And on a given day, when, look at that Egyptian border. At various airstrips all along the border, the entire Egyptian Air Force had their planes on the tarmac. And under cover of darkness, at night, Israel gave the command, bomb every airplane on the ground in Egypt. And in one night, wiped out essentially the entire Egyptian Air Force. Further, a book that I'd highly recommend is titled Our Man in Damascus. Talk about spycraft. A man named Eli Cohen. His family had been immigrants to Israel, Jews who had lived near Cairo, and so he grew up speaking Arabic, no accent, and they created a backstory for him, saying that he had some business in Europe and he was this family from such and such a Arab country, but they placed him in Damascus. And he began throwing these luxurious parties for people of prominence in the Syrian government and movers and shakers in Damascus. And he became quite popular. He even became an advisor to the then president and ratcheted that up to become what was be like the level of the Secretary of State today. His book, Our Man in Damascus, recounts how on one occasion he wanted to find a way to locate all of the military installations in the Golan Heights, from which their president had been lobbing down missiles to the fishing villages along the shores of the Sea of Galilee and harming innocent civilians. There's even a art piece, if you drive along the eastern coast of the Sea of Galilee and you look straight up the mountain, you see a metal art image of a man sitting there with a fishing rod, and dangling from the end of the fishing line is a lure in the shape of the Sea of Galilee with holes all in it. It represents Hafiz Assad, who was commanding the lobbing of those missiles to be shooting all around the Sea of Galilee. Well, Eli Cohen recommended that maybe these poor soldiers who were out here in the hot sun, you know, they're working so hard to defend our country of Syria, they need some shade to help them. Maybe we could plant some trees to give them shade. And nice shade trees are not common to that part of the world. And he said, but you know, if you look down at those fishing villages, a lot of them have planted eucalyptus trees. The Israelis imported them to drain the swamps, and maybe those would grow up here. And they said, yeah, go ahead, let's try that. And so they planted eucalyptus trees at every military installation in the Golan Heights. And on the same day that the Israeli army said bomb every airplane on the ground in Egypt, they said bomb every eucalyptus tree in the Golan Heights. And that took out quite a lot of the problem. And so this preemptive attack at the beginning of the Six-Day War, well, it really assisted, because of course all the war was full-blown by now. And as numerous books and films have been titled, you could look at the history of this war under the phrase, against all odds. Israel actually wins. And they even win control of the Golan Heights. And now Israel is looking down on Damascus instead of Damascus looking down on the Sea of Galilee. Further, they gain control all the way to the Jordan River. So this area that has been called the West Bank is now under the control of Israel again, at least the military control. There's still what is called the Green Line. You can see outlining this. And that green line is called such because that's exactly the color someone had when they wrote on a map in green and tried to carve out, this is where we're going to cease the fighting. It was never a boundary or an international border, but it's a serious demarcation right now between the areas that are allowed to have some Palestinian Authority self-governance, and this could have been the basis for the establishment, along with the Gaza Strip, of what would have been a Palestinian state, with the concept of a two-state solution, which has, up till recently, been the official position of every government of Israel. But after the events of October 7, that whole notion of a two-state solution, if the other state is really sworn to your destruction, is it really safe to promote that? Because time after time after time in this modern period, with neighbors that are very clear about their long-term intentions, if they will not recognize your right to live, then is it wise to establish them as a state without any negotiation? This, by the way, is a current crisis in light of the past wars, which we just kind of list here, and the past attempts at peace, where here's my favorite picture of two terrorists and a statesman. So often, Yasser Arafat would say what the West wants him to say in English, but then your Arabic doesn't have to be that fluent for you to translate when he yells jihad, jihad, jihad in Arabic. And yet, Israel is often vilified in the media as being the strongest army in the Middle East, and these poor Palestinian children are suffering at the hands of brutal Israeli armies. But in very recent years, you'll recall in 2020 the Abraham Accords, where first the United Arab Emirates and then Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco, and others were signing on, as President Trump said that today nations across the region and throughout the world are joining together, united in their determination to build a better future. The Abraham Accords. It looked as though even Saudi Arabia, which has for the first time ever been promoting tourism and foreign investment and direct flights to Tel Aviv, normalizing relationships. This infuriates those promoting the Palestinian cause because they do not recognize the right of Israel to exist. Or I can even remember looking on Google Maps and seeing all the nations around named, but when it came to the sliver of land where Israel exists, they refused to print the word Israel. It's tragic. Israel doesn't exist, or at least in their minds, it shouldn't exist. And other nations have been very close to signing on to say, we also want to let bygones be bygones and promote a better future for our children and future generations. And then just before some closing of those deals, October 7, 2023, and the massacre of over 1,200 Israelis. The murder and maiming, raping and torture, kidnapping, so that at first over 200 hostages, and now still somewhere around 136 or so hostages remain in captivity after October 7. There are certain times that you have to look back on and say, this is a demarcation line. This changes everything. And you have to realize that October 7 marked a day when on no other day in history have more Jewish lives been lost since the Holocaust than that day. And thus, if we're going to talk about the history, we almost can break history down as before October 7 and after October 7. Because this is presenting for us a new historical reality and tragedy in the region. And this is the current crisis about which we will speak tomorrow. Well, once again, I want to encourage you to think about these things from a biblical perspective. Numerous authors have contributed to this book, What Should We Think About Israel? The past president of Dallas Theological Seminary, Mark Bailey, past president of Gordon Conwell Seminary, Walter Kaiser, the head of Jews for Jesus, David Brickner of Chosen People Ministries, Mitch Glazer, Arnold Fruchtenbaum, myself, and numerous others have contributed chapters in this book, which contain questioning, journaling section at the end of each chapter and copious bibliography. I hope it encourages you to join us in praying for the peace of Jerusalem. And for those of you who might even be interested in traveling there to see with your own eyes and maybe even to be a source of help, we're transforming what's normally our study tour to Israel this June into a study, solidarity, and service tour where we'll take a couple of intentional days to not only see the living stones, meet Israelis, but look for ways to serve them. When I consulted with a few of my friends, like, what service projects exactly could we do? He said, that's like months away from now. Who knows? I mean, are we going to be attacked by all the surrounding Arab nations tomorrow? Nobody knows that. Are we? So if we are, maybe it's like rolling bandages and helping in hospitals. But if suddenly we have a détente, a little peace, and we're not in an active war zone anymore, then maybe we're in a rebuilding phase. Maybe we're painting walls and putting up homes, and the service projects between now and June, that only the Lord knows. So that's what I have to advertise. Only the Lord knows what type of service we might be rendering, but we certainly want to be prepared to do so. I also want to encourage your participation in the good ministries at Ariel. If you'd like to know more about Dr. Fruchtenbaum and the many global branches of Ariel Ministries and how we seek to be a light and a testimony to the Jew first and to all the nations, teaching the Bible from a Messianic Jewish perspective, you can pick up this brochure and you can note your own commitment, how that you can pray for the salvation of Jewish people, how you can prepare yourself to share the good news of Jesus the Messiah with your Jewish friends, and how you can pray for the work of Ariel Ministries. You can get our magazine, Ariel Magazine, which contains articles from a Messianic Jewish perspective, and join us in studying the Scriptures. But it's not only the magazine. You can take classes a la carte. Like, you don't have to sign up for a big degree program or something. It's just, I like that course, good. Swipe and take. This is Ariel College of the Bible and Messianic Jewish Studies, found at arielcollege.com. And then, of course, there's the opportunity to spend time with Dr. Fruchtenbaum and yours truly at Camp Shoshana, a beautiful 830-acre campus about an hour and a half south of Montreal in the Adirondacks. We'd love for you to come. There are 8 weeks of programming that run from July 1st through Labor Day weekend, and we invite your opportunity to learn more. Well, this concludes what I plan to share with you this morning. And do we have any questions? Or yes?
You mentioned earlier about Blackstone.
Yes.
Now the Blackstone, was that guy active at the end of the Ottoman Empire?
Yes, he was.
So the end of the Ottoman Empire was at the conclusion of World War I, right?
Yeah.
So why didn't Blackstone, when they were dividing up, when the League of Nations was dividing up the Ottoman Empire at the conclusion of World War I, why didn't they deal with this Israeli issue then more thoroughly?
So the question is, with the Blackstone Memorial and William E. Blackstone's desire to do something about what to do for the Jewish people at the end of World War I and the end of the Ottoman Empire, why wasn't it resolved then? Well, that's exactly why he wrote the Blackstone Memorial. And if you would look up the Blackstone Memorial, that's exactly what it's calling on the leaders of the free world to do. Just as we've carved up various parts of Europe to give this land to their ancient people and this land to their ancient inhabitants, and why not give the ancient land of Palestine to the Jewish people? That's what they were trying to do.
Right. Why did they give it to these Jewish people then instead of the British Empire?
Well,
Was
when
that
we
because
say the
British
British
Empire-
Empire, it was called the British Mandate period. And what were the British mandated to do? Figure this out. And how to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine. So the British were in control of this region, just like the French were in control of Lebanon
Yeah.
and then, you know,
in Syria.
in Syria. And it's just that they failed at their mandate. It was mandated for them to do this, but it was not successful.
And I forget there was some considerations that they had the Brits had oil in the back of their mind too, how they were going to keep the flow of oil going
Well,
or something like that. I can't remember specifically.
often political struggles can be analyzed better when you follow the money, right?
Yeah.
Next question. Yes, sir.
Why in the world was the Jewish people so nice to all their enemies? I mean, if it was Americans, we would have kicked butt, like we did with Japan. We blew up 2 big cities full of people, babies, everything. And they just don't hit too hard. Tell them we're coming. Drop leaflets.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I just can't believe how the Jewish people do.
And they don't get any credit for it.
No.
No.
You make a very good point. And for those listening, I'll mention that the question is, why does Israel tend to respond so delicately and politely when they're attacked? If it were America, you know how we've responded to being attacked. I think you, for the folks on video, will say, mentioned kicked butt, you know, we retaliated harshly. In fact, we could even go on to say that we basically destroyed 2 countries of Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11. But Israel doesn't get any credit for the fact that, look, they're dropping leaflets, they're text messaging in Arabic to the local residents of neighborhoods where a building is going to be demolished because it was used for a rocket launcher by Hamas. But Israel gets no credit for these humanitarian designs to not have collateral damage. Why is this? So there's, first of all, an admitted double standard, right? Like Israel can do no right. And yet, Israel has to do something because, again, they have sworn enemies who want to annihilate them. So you have to try to stop them. And yet, because of anti-Semitism, Israel is treated differently than any other nation. Can you imagine if some terrorist group in Mexico decided to cross the border into Houston and just wholesale start killing everybody?
There'd be no more Mexico.
There would be a terrible retaliation. And it doesn't matter if they wanted us in their country or not. Can you imagine? It would just, this is what powerful nations do. But Israel is definitely careful. 2 things, I think. One, they're so aware of world hatred. You just have to scratch a little tiny bit behind the surface, and anti-Semitism is everywhere you look. A hatred of the Jewish people. And so they're at a complete political disadvantage in terms of world opinion. And the media demonstrates this. You know, you have weird headlines like, Israeli military bombs, you know, Palestinian village. It doesn't start with how people from that Palestinian village launched missiles into Israel. It's Israel's retaliation that makes the front page. So there's a complete double standard. I think Israel is trying to be careful in light of the fact that they know that the media will somehow make it the victim's fault. But secondly, I think there really is in the heart of many Jewish people an awareness that the two great commandments, love God and love your neighbor. There's not a great desire to kill every Palestinian. You have slogans that say kill every Jewish person. But this is not an acceptable statement in any synagogue in the world where you'd have Jewish people saying, yeah, our goal is to annihilate Arabs. You don't, this is not a part of our value system. It's just not acceptable. It's anti-biblical. So I think that's part of the challenge. Yeah.
I kind of see it a lot in the Bible where it says love thy neighbor and all this. That's for each individual.
Yes.
But when it comes to government, its purpose, and even biblically, is to protect its people.
You're absolutely right. He said that the biblical statements about loving your neighbor, this is to be fulfilled on an individual level. But of course, from a governmental perspective, I think of Romans 13, for instance. The government does not bear the sword in vain. Their duty is to protect its citizens. Yeah, Jamie.
I don't know if you're going to get into this tomorrow, but just recently I've heard of some of the more left-wing politicians really coming out strong against Netanyahu and the government. But I also realized that a lot of the kibbutzim that were attacked were very left-wing and were actually planted themselves there in order to help the Gaza people.
Yes.
And they're not thinking as these politicians are thinking. What do you think is going on?
Well, again, Israel's not going to get much credit for this in the world press, but you're right. Many of these kibbutzim, farming villages and such, they were right near the Gaza Strip border with intentional designs to help poor, struggling Gazans and creating businesses that allowed Gazans to cross over with work permits and to have modern salaries and opportunity for social and economic upward mobility and medical care and the like. That many of the people in these surrounding villages were not right up against the border because they were such activists against Palestinians. They were activists in favor of Palestinians. And you can look at numerous nonprofit organizations founded in Israel that are against government policies that might be stricter against Palestinians and wanting to promote the betterment of local Arab populations. But you cannot find that allowed under the Palestinian Authority and under the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip. Instead, the only message that is acceptable is jihad, jihad, jihad. This Islamic destruction of the neighboring people of Israel. Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit tomorrow.
Okay.
All right, friends. I think that educational principle that says the mind can only absorb what the seat can endure has come to determine that our time is up. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim.
Very well.
And I'd like to